March 16th, 1968, a date that would become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in American military history. On this humid morning in the Quang Ngai province of South Vietnam, American soldiers would commit acts so horrific, so incomprehensible, that they would shake the very foundation of how the United States viewed itself and its mission in Southeast Asia. This is the story of the My Lai Massacre, a story of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, a story of fear, confusion, and the complete breakdown of military discipline and human morality. But most importantly, this is a story that must be told, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us, because forgetting the lessons of My Lai means condemning ourselves to repeat them. To understand what happened on that terrible March morning, we must first understand the war that made it possible. By 1968, the Vietnam War had been escalating for years. What began as a small advisory mission had grown into a massive military commitment involving over 500,000 American troops. The war had become a grinding, frustrating conflict, unlike anything the United States had experienced before. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The Viet Cong guerrillas didn't wear uniforms. They didn't mass for conventional battles. They struck from the shadows, planted booby traps, and then melted back into the population. American soldiers couldn't tell friend from foe. The farmer working in the rice paddy by day might be the guerrilla planting mines by night. The old woman selling vegetables in the market might be an intelligence agent. Even children could be dangerous, sometimes forced to plant explosives or serve as lookouts. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and fear among American troops. Every step could trigger a mine. Every tree line could hide a sniper. Every village could be a Viet Cong stronghold. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers watched their friends blown apart by hidden explosives, cut down by unseen enemies, and slowly they began to see all Vietnamese as potential threats. The Quang Ngai province, where My Lai was located, was known as a Viet Cong stronghold. The province had been contested territory since the French colonial period. By 1968, it was considered one of the most dangerous areas in South Vietnam. American units operating there suffered constant casualties from mines, booby traps, and ambushes. They rarely saw the enemy face to face, but the enemy was always there, always watching, always killing. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, 11th Brigade, 23rd Infantry Division had been operating in this area for 3 months. And those 3 months had been hell. The company had suffered 28 casualties, including 5 killed, almost all from mines and booby traps. They had never engaged the enemy in a stand-up fight. Their friends were being killed and maimed by an invisible enemy they could never strike back against. The psychological impact on these young soldiers cannot be overstated. Most were draftees, average age 19 or 20. They hadn't volunteered for this war. They'd been drafted, given minimal training, and thrown into a situation they didn't understand, fighting for objectives that weren't clear in a country whose culture was completely foreign to them. The frustration, the fear, the rage at watching friends die without being able to fight back, all of this was building inside them. Captain Ernest Medina commanded Charlie Company. He was 33 years old, a career soldier who had worked his way up from private. Medina was respected by his men, seen as a tough but fair leader. He understood the rage and frustration his troops felt. He shared it. His company was being slowly bled to death by an enemy they couldn't see or fight. In mid-March 1968, military intelligence reported that the 48th Viet Cong Battalion, one of the most effective enemy units in the area, was operating in the Sun Mai village area. Sun Mai was a collection of hamlets, including one designated on American maps as My Lai 4. Intelligence suggested that the Viet Cong battalion would be in these hamlets and that most of the civilian population would be away at the market early in the morning. On March 14th, 2 days before the operation, Captain Medina held a briefing for his men. What was said at this briefing would later become a matter of intense controversy. According to some soldiers, Medina ordered them to kill everything in the village, including women, children, and animals. According to others, including Medina himself, he ordered them to destroy the village and engage all enemy forces, but never ordered the killing of civilians. The truth of what was said that night will probably never be known with certainty. But what is certain is that many of the men who attended that briefing came away believing they had been ordered to kill everyone in the village. Whether Medina explicitly ordered this, or whether frustrated soldiers heard what they wanted to hear, the result was the same. They believed they were finally being unleashed, finally being allowed to strike back at the enemy that had been tormenting them for months. Lieutenant William Calley commanded 1st Platoon of Charlie Company. Calley was 24 years old, short, slight, and by all accounts not a particularly effective leader. He had washed out of college, drifted through various jobs, and been drafted. He'd gone through officer candidate school and received his commission, but he struggled with the responsibilities of leadership. His men didn't particularly respect him, and he seemed to compensate for this by trying to appear tough and aggressive. On the evening of March 15th, the men of Charlie Company prepared for the operation. They cleaned their weapons, checked their equipment, and tried to sleep. Some were excited. After months of walking through rice paddies and jungles, taking casualties from invisible enemies, they were finally going to engage the enemy in battle. They were going to hit back. Others were apprehensive. Something about this operation felt different, felt wrong, but they kept their concerns to themselves. The morning of March 16th dawned hot and humid, typical weather for that time of year in coastal Vietnam. The men of Charlie Company boarded helicopters at their base at Landing Zone Dottie. The helicopters, UH-1 Hueys, the iconic workhorses of the Vietnam War, lifted off in waves, skimming low over the green landscape toward the sun. My Village area. As the helicopters approached the landing zone, gunships raked the area with rocket and machine gun fire. This was standard procedure, designed to suppress any enemy forces that might be waiting to fire on the landing helicopters. The door gunners watched for muzzle flashes or any sign of enemy activity. They saw nothing. No return fire came from the village. The landing zone was cold, completely undefended. The helicopters flared and settled into the rice paddies west of My Lai 4. The soldiers jumped out and moved quickly away from the helicopters, forming up into their platoons. Still no enemy fire. The village ahead of them looked peaceful. Smoke rose from cooking fires. They could see people moving among the houses. 1st Platoon, under Lieutenant Calley, moved out first, heading directly toward the southern edge of the village. 2nd Platoon, under Lieutenant Stephen Brooks, moved to the north. 3rd Platoon stayed in reserve. The soldiers advanced cautiously at first, expecting to be fired upon at any moment, but nothing happened. The village remained quiet except for the normal sounds of rural life. As 1st Platoon approached the village edge, they began to encounter people. Old men, women, children, going about their morning routines. The villagers showed no signs of hostility. They weren't armed. They didn't run. Some came out of their homes and stood watching the Americans, curious or perhaps frightened, but not threatening. What happened next would shock the world. Instead of securing the village and searching for weapons or Viet Cong fighters, 1st Platoon began killing. Soldiers moved through the village shooting people indiscriminately. Men, women, children, infants. They shot people in their homes, in the rice paddies, on the village paths. They threw grenades into houses and bunkers. They rounded up groups of villagers and executed them with automatic weapons fire. Private Dennis Conti later testified that he saw Lieutenant Calley and Private Paul Meadlow herding a group of about 70 to 80 villagers, mostly women, children, and old men, into a ditch on the eastern edge of the village. Calley ordered Meadlow to guard them. Then Calley walked away. When he returned, he asked Meadlow why he hadn't killed them yet. Meadlow, shocked, said he thought Calley just wanted him to guard them. Calley said no, he wanted them dead. And then Calley and Meadlow opened fire on the people in the ditch, shooting until their magazines were empty, reloading, and shooting again. Specialist 4. Robert Maples described seeing Lieutenant Calley grab a villager by the hair and throw him down a well, then fire his weapon into the well. Other soldiers reported seeing Calley shoot a monk who was trying to help wounded villagers. They saw him shoot a 2-year-old child who was trying to crawl away from the ditch where his family had just been murdered. But Calley wasn't acting alone. Throughout the village, other members of 1st Platoon, and some from 2nd Platoon, were engaged in similar atrocities. They shot people who were trying to run. They shot people who were kneeling and praying. They shot people who were hiding in bunkers. They bayoneted those they didn't shoot. They beat people to death with their rifle butts. The killing took on a systematic quality. Soldiers moved from house to house, pulling people out and shooting them. They rounded up groups and executed them. They burned houses with people still inside. Animals weren't spared either. Water buffalo, pigs, chickens, all were shot. The village was being systematically destroyed, and everyone in it was being murdered. Some soldiers participated actively in the killing. Others followed orders reluctantly, later claiming they were afraid of being punished or even shot if they refused. But some soldiers refused to participate at all. They were the moral heroes of that terrible day. Men who found the courage to say no, even in the midst of madness. Private Herbert Carter refused to fire on civilians and even shot himself in the foot to escape the carnage. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, a helicopter pilot flying overhead, witnessed the massacre from the air. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. American soldiers systematically murdering unarmed civilians. Women and children lying dead in ditches and rice paddies. Thompson landed his helicopter between a group of fleeing villagers and pursuing American soldiers. He ordered his crew chief to train his machine gun on the American soldiers and shoot them if they tried to harm the civilians. It was an extraordinary act of moral courage, an American soldier threatening to fire on other American soldiers to protect Vietnamese civilians. Thompson then radioed for other helicopters to help evacuate the surviving villagers. Specialist Glenn Andreatta, Thompson's crew chief, climbed down into a ditch filled with bodies and pulled out a 4-year-old boy, the only survivor among the pile of corpses. The child was covered in blood, but miraculously uninjured. Thompson took the boy to safety, likely saving his life. But Thompson and his crew could only do so much. The massacre continued for hours. By midday, the killing finally began to wind down, not because of moral awakening or external intervention, but simply because most of the villagers were already dead. The soldiers grew tired. The initial fury that had driven them faded into a kind of numb exhaustion. As the soldiers regrouped and prepared to move out, they left behind a scene of unimaginable horror. Bodies lay everywhere, in houses, in ditches, in rice paddies, on the village paths. Most were women, children, and elderly men. Many had been shot multiple times. Some had been mutilated. The village itself was largely destroyed. Houses burned, animals dead, crops trampled. The official body count reported by Charlie Company that day was 128 enemy killed. Not one weapon was found in the village. No Viet Cong fighters were among the dead. It was later estimated that between 350 and 500 Vietnamese civilians were murdered at My Lai that day, more than half of them children. As the helicopters came to extract Charlie Company, the soldiers climbed aboard, many in a daze. Some seemed pleased with the day's work, convinced they had struck a blow against the enemy. Others were quiet, already beginning to process what they had done, what they had witnessed. A few were in shock, unable to reconcile the actions of that day with any moral code they had known before Vietnam. Back at base, there was an initial sense of celebration. A major operation had been conducted with no American casualties, and a high body count had been achieved. In the metrics-obsessed American approach to the Vietnam War, where success was measured in enemy killed, it looked like a successful day. But some who had been there knew better. They knew that something terrible had happened, something that went beyond the already brutal norms of war. Hugh Thompson immediately reported what he had seen to his superiors. He told them that American soldiers had massacred civilians. His report was met with skepticism and hostility. No one wanted to hear that American troops had committed atrocities. Thompson was told he was mistaken, that the villagers had been caught in crossfire, that they were Viet Cong sympathizers. His report was essentially buried. But Thompson wasn't the only one who knew what had happened. Every soldier in Charlie Company knew. The helicopter crews that had flown support knew. The commanders who had planned the operation knew something had gone very wrong when no weapons were found, and there were no American casualties despite the high reported body count. The question was whether anyone would speak up, whether anyone would demand an accounting for what had happened at My Lai. In the immediate aftermath, the answer seemed to be no. The official reports described a successful operation against a Viet Cong stronghold. The civilian casualties were described as unavoidable in the context of combat operations. The massacre was being covered up, and it seemed like it might stay covered up. After all, similar incidents, though perhaps not on the same scale, had occurred throughout the war. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were routinely destroyed. Civilian casualties were common and often dismissed as the tragic but inevitable cost of war. But My Lai was different, not just in scale but in character. This wasn't civilians caught in crossfire. This wasn't a village destroyed in the course of fighting the enemy. This was cold-blooded murder, systematic and deliberate. And despite the initial cover-up, the truth had a way of refusing to stay buried. In the weeks following the massacre, some soldiers began to struggle with what they had witnessed or participated in. The human mind can rationalize many things in the heat of the moment, driven by fear and rage and group pressure. But in the quiet aftermath, conscience has a way of reasserting itself. Some soldiers were having nightmares, some were drinking heavily, some were simply carrying a weight of guilt and horror that they couldn't shake. One of those soldiers was Ronald Riddenhauer. Riddenhauer hadn't been at My Lai that day. He was in a different company. But in the weeks and months after the massacre, he heard stories from friends who had been there. At first, he didn't believe the stories. They seemed too horrible, too extreme. But as he heard the same accounts from multiple sources, he began to realize that something terrible really had happened. Riddenhauer was appalled. He believed in America, believed in the principles his country claimed to stand for. What had happened at My Lai violated everything he thought America represented. He decided that he couldn't stay silent. When his tour in Vietnam ended and he returned to the United States, Riddenhauer resolved to make sure the truth about My Lai came to light. In March 1969, exactly 1 year after the massacre, Riddenhauer sent a letter to 30 members of Congress, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House. In that letter, he detailed what he had learned about the massacre at My Lai. He named names, he described atrocities, he demanded an investigation. Most of the recipients of Riddenhauer's letter did nothing. They filed it away or ignored it altogether. But Congressman Morris Udall took it seriously. He forwarded the letter to the Pentagon and demanded answers. The Pentagon couldn't ignore a congressional inquiry. They had to investigate. The Army assigned Colonel William Wilson to conduct an investigation. Wilson was thorough and persistent. He tracked down soldiers who had been at My Lai and interviewed them. At first, many refused to talk or claimed they couldn't remember details. The bonds of military brotherhood are strong, and there was enormous pressure to keep silent. But Wilson kept pushing, and gradually soldiers began to talk. What Colonel Wilson uncovered was even worse than Riddenhauer's letter had suggested. Interview by interview, statement by statement, a picture emerged of systematic mass murder. Soldiers described in detail the killing of unarmed civilians. They described the orders they had received, the atrocities they had witnessed, the actions they themselves had taken. Some spoke with remorse, others were defensive or tried to justify their actions. But the basic facts were undeniable. A massacre had occurred at My Lai, and it had been covered up. Wilson's investigation reached up the chain of command. He examined who knew what and when they knew it. He looked at the initial reports and how they had been altered or sanitized. He investigated the officers who had planned and supervised the operation. What he found was that multiple officers at various levels of command had either participated in the cover-up or had been willfully blind to obvious signs that something terrible had happened. In September 1969, the Army brought charges against Lieutenant William Calley for the premeditated murder of 109 Vietnamese civilians. Calley was arrested at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he had been stationed after returning from Vietnam. The Army also brought charges against several other soldiers and officers, including Captain Ernest Medina and several members of Calley's platoon. Initially, the Army tried to keep the investigation and charges quiet. They knew this would be a public relations disaster. The Vietnam War was already deeply unpopular, and news that American soldiers had massacred hundreds of civilians would inflame anti-war sentiment and damage America's image around the world. But keeping it quiet proved impossible. In November 1969, journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story publicly. Hersh had been tipped off about the investigation and had tracked down Calley and other principals. His articles, distributed by the Dispatch News Service, were picked up by newspapers across America. The story exploded into the national consciousness. My Lai was suddenly front-page news. The American public was shocked and divided. Many simply refused to believe that American soldiers could commit such atrocities. They saw the story as enemy propaganda or anti-war fabrication. Others were horrified, but not entirely surprised. They had suspected all along that terrible things were happening in Vietnam. and My Lai confirmed their worst fears. The massacre became another flashpoint in the already bitter debate over the war. Then, in December 1969, the Cleveland Plain Dealer published photographs from My Lai. Army photographer Ronald Haberly had been with Charlie Company that day, and he had photographed the massacre. He had taken official black and white photographs for the Army, but he had also taken color photographs with his personal camera. The Army photographs had disappeared, likely destroyed as part of the cover-up, but Haberly had kept his personal color photographs. The photographs were devastating. They showed dead women and children piled in ditches. They showed terrified villagers moments before they were killed. They showed the casual brutality of American soldiers among the carnage. These weren't abstract allegations anymore. These were visual proof that American soldiers had murdered civilians in cold blood. The photographs appeared in newspapers and magazines across America and around the world. There was no denying what had happened anymore. The public reaction was intense. Anti-war protesters seized on My Lai as proof that the war was immoral and that American forces were committing war crimes. Pro-war voices argued that My Lai was an aberration, that it didn't represent the conduct of the vast majority of American troops, and that the focus on one incident was undermining military morale and giving aid to the enemy. The controversy extended to Hugh Thompson, the helicopter pilot who had intervened to stop the killing. Thompson and his crew were initially treated as whistleblowers and troublemakers by the military. Some even accused them of being traitors for threatening to fire on American soldiers. It would be decades before Thompson and his crew received official recognition for their heroism. As public attention intensified, the Army expanded its investigation. They examined not just the massacre itself, but the entire chain of command and the systemic failures that had made it possible. What they found was deeply troubling. The breakdown went far beyond Charlie Company. It touched on fundamental problems with how the war was being fought, how soldiers were trained, how success was measured, and how atrocities were reported and investigated. The military justice system prepared for the trials. Lieutenant Calley would be the primary defendant, but others would also face charges. Captain Medina was charged with murder and manslaughter. 12 other officers were charged with various offenses related to the massacre or its cover-up. Several enlisted men were also charged. It appeared that there would be a comprehensive accounting for what had happened at My Lai. But as the legal process unfolded, that comprehensive accounting failed to materialize. Charges against most defendants were dropped or reduced. The military justice system seemed reluctant to pursue the cases aggressively. By the time trials began, only Lieutenant Calley and a few others were still facing serious charges, and even some of those would eventually be dropped. Captain Medina went to trial in August 1971. His defense argued that Medina had not ordered the killing of civilians and had not known about the full extent of the massacre until afterward. The prosecution struggled to prove what orders Medina had given and what he had known. After a relatively short deliberation, the jury, composed of military officers, acquitted Medina on all charges. The acquittal was controversial. Many believed that Medina, as the commanding officer, bore responsibility for the actions of his men, even if he hadn't directly ordered the killings. Others pointed out that the burden of proof in a criminal trial is high, and that reasonable doubt existed about exactly what Medina had said and known. But the practical effect of the acquittal was that the responsibility for My Lai would rest almost entirely on the shoulders of lower-ranking soldiers, particularly Lieutenant Calley. Calley's trial began in November 1970. It would last 4 months and become one of the most closely watched military trials in American history. The courtroom at Fort Benning became a focal point for the nation's conflicted feelings about the war and about My Lai specifically. The prosecution presented a detailed case. They called soldiers who had witnessed Calley shooting civilians. They presented evidence of specific murders that Calley had committed. They showed that Calley had ordered his men to kill villagers and had personally participated in mass executions. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing Calley shoot unarmed civilians, including children. They described the massacre at the ditch in horrific detail. Calley's defense didn't really dispute the facts. Instead, they argued that Calley was following orders. His lawyers claimed that Captain Medina had ordered the destruction of the village and the killing of everyone in it. They argued that Calley was a scapegoat. a low-ranking officer being made to pay for decisions made higher up the chain of command. They portrayed Cali as a confused young officer trying to do his duty in an impossible situation. Cali himself testified in his own defense. He admitted to the killings but claimed he was following orders and that he believed those orders were lawful. He portrayed himself as a soldier doing his duty, albeit a terrible duty, in a brutal war. His testimony was emotionally powerful, and many in the public sympathized with his position even if they didn't condone his actions. The trial forced Americans to confront difficult questions. If Cali was following orders, who gave those orders, and why weren't they on trial? If the entire chain of command shared responsibility, why was only a lieutenant facing justice? More fundamentally, how had the American military reached a point where young officers thought it was acceptable, even ordered, to murder civilians? In March 1971, the jury returned its verdict. Cali was found guilty of the premeditated murder of at least 22 civilians. He was sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. It appeared that there would be at least some accountability for My Lai. But the verdict and sentence sparked a massive public backlash. Millions of Americans believed that Cali was being scapegoated, that he was taking the fall for policies and failures that went far up the chain of command. They saw him as a victim of an unjust war and an unfair military justice system. Calls for clemency flooded in from across the country. Public opinion polls showed that a majority of Americans opposed Cali's conviction. The political pressure was immense. President Richard Nixon, ever attuned to public opinion, intervened. 3 days after the verdict, Nixon ordered that Cali be released from the stockade at Fort Benning and placed under house arrest in his apartment on the base. It was an extraordinary intervention by the commander-in-chief into the military justice system. Over the next several years, Cali's sentence was repeatedly reduced through various legal and administrative actions. His life sentence was reduced to 20 years, then to 10 years. In November 1974, a federal judge overturned his conviction entirely, ruling that Cali had not received a fair trial due to pre-trial publicity. However, the appeals court reversed this decision and reinstated the conviction. Ultimately, Cali served only 3.5 years under house arrest at Fort Benning. He was paroled in November 1974 and released from the Army with a dishonorable discharge. He never spent a single day in a military prison. For the murder of at least 22 civilians, and possibly many more, William Cali served 3.5 years under house arrest. No one else was ever convicted for the My Lai massacre. The charges against other soldiers were dropped or resulted in acquittals. No senior officers were held accountable. The prosecution of Colonel Orrin Henderson, the brigade commander, ended in acquittal. The charges against Major General Samuel Coster, the division commander, were dropped, though he was demoted and lost a Distinguished Service Medal. The failure to achieve comprehensive accountability for My Lai sent a troubling message. It suggested that atrocities committed in war would not be seriously punished, especially if the perpetrators could claim they were following orders or if pursuing justice proved politically unpopular. It meant that the systemic failures that had enabled My Lai would not be fully addressed. But the impact of My Lai extended far beyond the courtroom. The massacre and its aftermath had profound effects on the American military, on American society, and on how the world viewed America's role in Vietnam and beyond. For the military, My Lai forced a reckoning with the conduct of the war. The massacre highlighted how the emphasis on body counts as a metric of success had created perverse incentives. If success was measured by how many enemies you killed, and if it was impossible to distinguish enemy combatants from civilians, then terrible outcomes were almost inevitable. The military began to reassess its tactics and its metrics for success. My Lai also revealed the dangers of poor leadership and inadequate training. Many of the officers and soldiers involved in the massacre had been rushed through training. They didn't understand the laws of war. They didn't have adequate leadership in the field. The military expanded its training. Programs to include more emphasis on the law of armed conflict, on ethical decision-making, and on the responsibilities of leadership. The massacre demonstrated the importance of moral courage and the willingness to disobey illegal orders. Hugh Thompson's intervention and his willingness to threaten American soldiers to protect Vietnamese civilians became a case study in military ethics. The military began to emphasize that soldiers have an obligation to refuse illegal orders, even in combat. even when facing pressure from superiors and peers. For American society, My Lai shattered illusions about American exceptionalism and moral superiority. Americans had always believed that their country was fundamentally good, that American soldiers were the good guys who fought clean wars and respected civilian lives. My Lai proved that American soldiers were capable of the same atrocities that Americans had condemned in other armies throughout history. The massacre deepened the divide over the Vietnam War. Anti-war activists used My Lai as evidence that the war was fundamentally immoral and that American forces were committing war crimes as a matter of policy. Pro-war voices argued that My Lai was an aberration and that focusing on it undermined military morale and helped the enemy. This debate would continue for decades. My Lai also raised profound questions about individual and collective responsibility. Who was responsible for the massacre? Was it just the soldiers who pulled the triggers? Was it their officers who may have given ambiguous or illegal orders? Was it the generals who created a system that measured success by body counts? Was it the politicians who sent American troops to fight a war without clear objectives or constraints? Was it the American people who supported or tolerated the war? These questions didn't have easy answers, and different people drew different conclusions. But the questions themselves were important. They forced Americans to think about what their country was doing in Vietnam and about the moral costs of the war. Internationally, My Lai severely damaged America's reputation. The United States had positioned itself as the defender of freedom and democracy, the force for good in the world, standing against communist tyranny. But images of dead Vietnamese children piled in ditches, killed by American soldiers, made that narrative much harder to sustain. America's enemies used My Lai as propaganda, but even America's allies were shocked and disturbed. The massacre also had a lasting impact on the Vietnamese people and on Vietnamese-American relations. For the Vietnamese, My Lai was one of many atrocities they suffered during the war, but it was the one that received the most international attention. It became a symbol of the suffering inflicted on Vietnamese civilians. The village of My Lai, now known as Sun Mai, has been preserved as a memorial site, a place where visitors can confront the reality of what happened and remember the victims. For the survivors of My Lai and the families of the victims, the wounds have never fully healed. They lost parents, children, siblings, friends in a few hours of senseless violence. Many survivors bore physical scars from their wounds. All bore psychological scars from witnessing unimaginable horror. The failure to fully hold the perpetrators accountable added to their pain. In the years after the massacre, various efforts were made to provide some measure of justice or reconciliation. In 1998, 30 years after the massacre, Hugh Thompson and his crew were awarded the Soldier's Medal, the Army's highest award for bravery not involving direct conflict with the enemy. It was a belated recognition of their moral courage, but it also served as an implicit acknowledgement that what happened at My Lai was fundamentally wrong. In 2009, William Calley made a public apology for his role in the massacre. Speaking to a Kiwanis club in Columbus, Georgia, Calley said there was not a day that went by that he did not feel remorse for what happened that day in My Lai. It was the first time Calley had publicly expressed remorse for the massacre. For some, it was too little too late. For others, it was at least an acknowledgement of responsibility. But apologies and medals cannot undo what happened. The dead remain dead. The families remain broken. The village remains destroyed. And the questions raised by My Lai remain relevant. What allows ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil? The soldiers who participated in the My Lai massacre were not monsters. They were ordinary young men from ordinary American towns. Most had no history of violence or cruelty. Yet, under certain conditions, in a certain context, they committed horrific acts. Understanding how this happened is crucial to preventing it from happening again. Several factors came together at My Lai. There was the dehumanization of the enemy and of Vietnamese people generally. American soldiers had been taught to see Vietnamese as less than human, as gooks rather than people. This made it psychologically easier to kill them. There was the rage and frustration built up from months of casualties with no opportunity to strike back. The soldiers of Charlie Company had watched friends die and had been unable to retaliate. At My Lai, they finally had targets they could hit. There was the diffusion of responsibility that comes from group action. When everyone is killing, individual soldiers could tell themselves they were just following the crowd. just doing what everyone else was doing. There was the authority of orders, or perceived orders. Soldiers had been trained to obey orders without question, and many believed they had been ordered to kill everyone in the village. Even those who hadn't received explicit orders to kill civilians could rationalize that this was what their superiors wanted. There was the absence of effective leadership. The officers who should have stopped the killing either participated in it themselves or failed to exercise moral courage. There was the breakdown of discipline and training. Basic rules of engagement and laws of war were forgotten or ignored in the heat of the moment. And there was the psychological impact of war itself, the desensitization to violence, the erosion of normal moral constraints that happens when people are immersed in killing day after day. All of these factors came together at My Lai to create the conditions for massacre, but none of them excuses what happened. Understanding is not the same as forgiving. The soldiers who participated in the massacre made choices, and those choices had consequences. The failure to fully hold them accountable for those choices remains one of the great injustices of the Vietnam War. The legacy of My Lai extends far beyond the events of March 16, 1968. It changed how wars are fought, how soldiers are trained, how atrocities are reported, and how America views itself and its military. More than 5 decades later, My Lai remains a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkest possibilities of human nature and the importance of moral courage. In the immediate aftermath of My Lai and the public revelations about the massacre, the Army instituted significant reforms. They completely revamped training on the law of armed conflict. Every soldier now receives instruction on the Geneva Conventions, on the laws of war, on what constitutes an illegal order, and on the obligation to refuse such orders. The reforms emphasize that following orders is not an absolute defense, that soldiers have a moral and legal obligation to refuse orders to commit war crimes. The Army also changed how it trained leaders. The emphasis shifted from purely tactical and technical skills to include leadership ethics and moral decision-making. Officers are now taught about My Lai and other cases where leadership failures led to atrocities. They study Hugh Thompson as an example of moral courage and are taught that real leadership means having the courage to do the right thing even when it's difficult or dangerous. The military justice system was also reformed in the wake of My Lai. Procedures for investigating and prosecuting war crimes were strengthened. The chain of command's role in investigations was clarified to prevent cover-ups. Protections for whistleblowers were enhanced so that soldiers who report misconduct would face less retaliation. These reforms were not perfect, and problems with military justice persist, but My Lai did prompt significant improvements. The emphasis on body counts as a metric of success, which had contributed to the atmosphere that made My Lai possible, was largely abandoned. Military leaders recognized that counting enemy dead created perverse incentives and didn't actually measure progress toward achieving strategic objectives. Future conflicts would use different metrics, though the search for quantifiable measures of success in war remains an ongoing challenge. The role of embedded journalists and media coverage of war also changed after My Lai. The massacre had been hidden for over a year, and it only came to light because of the efforts of individuals like Ronald Riddenhauer and Seymour Hersh. This raised questions about military transparency and media access. In subsequent conflicts, the military has struggled to balance operational security with public accountability. But My Lai demonstrated the importance of independent reporting and the dangers of allowing the military to completely control the narrative about its operations. The international law of armed conflict was also strengthened in the aftermath of My Lai and other Vietnam War atrocities. The Geneva Conventions were expanded and clarified. New protocols were added to provide better protection for civilians in war zones. International criminal tribunals were established to prosecute war crimes. While enforcement remains inconsistent and powerful nations can often avoid accountability, the legal framework for prosecuting atrocities is stronger because of cases like My Lai. But perhaps the most important legacy of My Lai is, as a case study in ethics and human behavior. The massacre is taught in military academies, in ethics courses, in psychology classes, anywhere people study how ordinary individuals can commit extraordinary evil and what can be done to prevent it. The story of My Lai illustrates several key lessons about human behavior in extreme situations. First, it shows the power of authority and obedience. Stanley Milgram's famous experiments on obedience to authority were being conducted around the same time as My Lai, and they demonstrated that ordinary people will do terrible things if ordered to by an authority figure. My Lai provided a real-world example of this phenomenon. Soldiers who never would have murdered civilians under normal circumstances did so because they believed they had been ordered to, or because they saw their superiors and peers doing it. Second, My Lai demonstrates the importance of dehumanization in enabling atrocities. When people are seen as less than human, as others who don't deserve the same moral consideration as members of our own group, it becomes psychologically easier to harm them. The racism and cultural prejudice that characterized much of the American approach to Vietnam made it easier for soldiers to see Vietnamese people as enemies rather than as human beings deserving of protection and respect. Third, the massacre shows how group dynamics can override individual moral judgment. Many of the soldiers at My Lai later said they knew what they were doing was wrong, but they did it anyway because everyone else was doing it. The power of conformity, the desire to fit in with the group, the fear of being seen as weak or disloyal, all of these social pressures can overwhelm individual conscience. Fourth, My Lai illustrates how stress, fear, and anger can erode moral constraints. The soldiers of Charlie Company had been under tremendous stress. They had suffered casualties for months without being able to strike back at the enemy. This built up rage and frustration that was released at My Lai. While this doesn't excuse their actions, it helps explain how normal people can snap and commit atrocities under the right conditions. Fifth, the massacre demonstrates the crucial importance of leadership in preventing atrocities. Where there were strong ethical leaders at My Lai, the killing was stopped or prevented. Hugh Thompson and his crew stopped as much killing as they could. Some platoon leaders and squad leaders refused to participate and prevented their men from participating. But where leadership was weak or complicit, the killing proceeded unchecked. Good leadership, grounded in clear moral principles and enforced with courage, is essential to preventing atrocities. The story of My Lai also raises difficult questions about accountability and justice. The failure to comprehensively punish those responsible for the massacre sent a troubling message about the value of Vietnamese lives, and about the seriousness with which America takes war crimes when committed by its own forces. The fact that William Calley served only 3.5 years under house arrest for murdering at least 22 civilians, and possibly many more, suggested that American soldiers could commit atrocities with relative impunity. This perception has been reinforced by subsequent cases. In the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there have been numerous documented cases of American forces killing civilians under questionable circumstances. While some of these cases resulted in prosecutions and convictions, many did not. The pattern established at My Lai, where low-ranking soldiers might be held accountable but senior officers and policymakers avoid consequences, has continued. The question of who bears ultimate responsibility for My Lai remains contested. Some argue that the soldiers who pulled the triggers bear full responsibility for their choices. They were not forced to kill unarmed civilians. They chose to do so, and they should pay the full consequences. This view emphasizes individual moral agency and the fundamental principle that people are responsible for their own actions. Others argue that responsibility extends up the chain of command. The officers who planned the operation, who created an atmosphere where such atrocities were possible, who failed to properly train and supervise their troops, who covered up the massacre afterward, all bear significant responsibility. This view holds that in a hierarchical military organization, leaders must be held accountable for the actions of their subordinates. Still others argue that the responsibility goes even higher, to the generals who prosecuted the war with body counts and free fire zones, to the politicians who sent troops into an unwinnable war without clear objectives or rules of engagement, even to the American public who supported or tolerated the war. This view sees My Lai as a symptom of a broader moral failure, not just an isolated incident. There is probably truth in all of these perspectives. Individual soldiers made choices and bear individual responsibility. Leaders failed in their duties and bear command responsibility. The system that created the conditions for My Lai was fundamentally flawed, and those who designed and sustained that system bear systemic responsibility. Apportioning blame is less important than learning the lessons so that similar atrocities can be prevented in the future. For the Vietnamese people, My Lai is remembered as one of many tragedies inflicted during the war. The village of Sun, My has been turned into a memorial site. Visitors can walk through the reconstructed village, see markers where victims died, visit the museum that documents the massacre. It is a somber, difficult place, but an important one. It ensures that the victims are remembered and that the world does not forget what happened. Every year on March 16th, a ceremony is held at the memorial to honor the victims. Survivors attend, along with Vietnamese officials and sometimes international visitors. The names of the dead are read aloud. Incense is burned. Prayers are offered. It is a reminder that behind the statistics and the historical analysis, there were real people who died at My Lai. Mothers and children, fathers and grandparents, individuals with names and lives and dreams, all cut short by senseless violence. Some of the survivors have shared their stories over the years. They described the morning the helicopters came, the confusion and terror as the shooting started, the desperate attempts to hide or flee, the unimaginable horror of watching family members killed before their eyes. Their testimony is difficult to hear, but essential to confront. It puts human faces on the statistics and reminds us of the real cost of the massacre. Reconciliation between America and Vietnam has been a long and difficult process, but it has progressed significantly since the end of the war. Diplomatic relations were restored in the 1990s. Trade and cultural exchanges have grown. Many Americans now visit Vietnam as tourists, including veterans returning to see the country in peacetime. Young Vietnamese are remarkably open to Americans, showing little of the bitterness one might expect given the history. But My Lai remains a complicated issue in this reconciliation. For many Vietnamese, it symbolizes the suffering inflicted by American forces. The fact that there was never comprehensive accountability for the massacre remains a source of pain and resentment. American officials have generally avoided discussing My Lai in detail, reluctant to reopen old wounds or take on responsibility for events so long ago. In 2008, the 40th anniversary of the massacre, there were ceremonies and commemorations at the memorial site. Some American veterans attended, including Michael Bernhardt, who had been with Charlie Company but had refused to participate in the killing. His presence was seen as a gesture of acknowledgement and remorse, even if the American government offered no official apology. The question of whether America should issue a formal apology for My Lai has been debated periodically. Proponents argue that an official acknowledgement and apology would be an important gesture of respect for the victims and a recognition of responsibility. Opponents worry that an official apology could open the door to legal claims or create political complications. So far, no formal apology has been issued, though individual Americans, including veterans, have offered personal apologies. The lessons of My Lai remain relevant in the 21st century. Despite the reforms and training that followed the massacre, atrocities continue to occur in war zones around the world. American forces have been implicated in unlawful killings of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. The abuses at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq echoed some of the same failures of leadership and breakdown of discipline that characterize My Lai. Other countries' forces have committed atrocities and conflicts from Syria to Yemen to Myanmar. Each new case raises the same fundamental questions. What causes ordinary people to commit atrocities? How can such acts be prevented? How should perpetrators be held accountable? Who bears responsibility beyond the individuals who directly commit the acts? My Lai provides no easy answers to these questions, but it provides a framework for thinking about them and a warning about what can happen when the wrong answers are chosen. The role of individuals in preventing atrocities remains crucial. Hugh Thompson's courage at My Lai saved lives and eventually helped bring the massacre to light. His example shows that one person with moral courage can make a difference even in the midst of madness. But Thompson paid a price for his courage. He faced hostility and threats from fellow soldiers who saw him as a traitor. It was decades before he received official recognition for his actions. This highlights one of the persistent challenges in preventing atrocities. Those who speak up or intervene often face severe consequences. They are accused of disloyalty, of undermining unit cohesion, of giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Creating systems and cultures that protect and honor moral courage, rather than punishing it, is essential but difficult. The military has made efforts to create such systems. whistleblower protections have been strengthened. Training emphasizes the obligation to report and stop illegal actions. Examples like Thompson are held up as models of proper conduct, but challenges remain. Military culture still places enormous emphasis on loyalty and unity, cohesion. Questioning orders or reporting misconduct can still result in social and professional consequences. The pressure to stay silent, to go along, to not make waves remains powerful. Technology has changed some aspects of how atrocities unfold and how they are documented. At My Lai, an army photographer was present and documented the massacre, but those photographs were nearly lost. In modern conflicts, many soldiers carry personal cameras and phones. Atrocities are more likely to be documented and harder to cover up. Social media can spread evidence of abuses rapidly. This increased transparency is generally positive, but it also creates new challenges in verifying information and protecting privacy and dignity of victims. The laws of war have also evolved since My Lai. International humanitarian law is more developed and more widely accepted. International criminal tribunals have prosecuted war crimes in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and elsewhere. The International Criminal Court was established to provide a permanent forum for prosecuting the most serious international crimes. But enforcement remains highly uneven. Powerful countries, including the United States, often resist subjecting their nationals to international justice. The strategic consequences of atrocities like My Lai are also worth considering. In the short term, atrocities may seem to serve military objectives. The village of My Lai was destroyed and the population was eliminated, but the strategic costs were enormous. My Lai turned international opinion against America's war effort. It energized the anti-war movement. It damaged America's moral authority and credibility. It made it harder to win hearts and minds in Vietnam. The massacre was a strategic disaster, far outweighing any tactical advantage. This pattern has repeated in subsequent conflicts. Atrocities rarely serve strategic interests, and often severely undermine them. The abuses at Abu Ghraib were a propaganda gift to insurgents and terrorists. They damaged America's reputation and made the mission in Iraq more difficult. Even from a purely cynical, amoral perspective focused only on winning wars, atrocities are usually counterproductive. The moral case against atrocities is clear and compelling, but even the strategic case should be enough to prevent them. Education about My Lai continues to be important. As time passes and the Vietnam War recedes into history, there is a risk that the lessons of My Lai will be forgotten. New generations of soldiers, officers, and citizens need to learn what happened and why it matters. The massacre should be taught not just as historical fact, but as a case study in ethics, leadership, and human behavior. This education should be uncomfortable. It should not shy away from the graphic details of what happened. It should not soften the horror to make it more palatable. The discomfort is part of the point. People need to confront what humans are capable of doing to each other so they can recognize the warning signs and resist the pressures that lead to atrocities. At the same time, the education should not be purely negative. The story of My Lai includes heroes as well as villains. Hugh Thompson and his crew, the soldiers who refused to participate, Ronald Ridenhour, who brought the massacre to light, Seymour Hersh, who investigated and reported the story. All of these individuals showed moral courage and deserve to be remembered and honored. Their examples show that doing the right thing is possible even in the most difficult circumstances. The psychological impact of My Lai on those who were there, both Vietnamese and American, should not be forgotten. The survivors carry trauma that lasts a lifetime. Many have struggled with PTSD, depression, and other mental health issues. The massacre shattered their sense of safety and trust. Some of the American soldiers who participated or witnessed the massacre have also struggled with guilt, shame, and trauma. War's psychological wounds can be as lasting as its physical ones. This highlights the importance of mental health support for veterans and survivors of atrocities. Many of the soldiers who returned from Vietnam did not receive adequate psychological care. They were expected to simply readjust to civilian life without processing the trauma they had experienced. This failure contributed to high rates of substance abuse, homelessness, and suicide among Vietnam veterans. Subsequent wars have seen improved mental health support for veterans, but gaps remain. The media's role in covering war and exposing atrocities deserves consideration. My Lai might never have come to light without journalists like Seymour Hersh, who were willing to investigate and report uncomfortable truths. But the media also faced criticism for how it covered My Lai. Some argued that publishing the photographs was exploitative and disrespectful to the victims. Others argued that focusing on one atrocity gave a distorted picture of the war. These tensions remain in modern conflict reporting. Journalists must balance the public's right to know against concerns about sensationalism, the dignity of victims, operational security, and the safety of journalists themselves. The principles established during Vietnam, that the media has a role in holding the military accountable and that the public needs to know what is being done in its name, remain important even as the practical challenges of implementing those principles evolve. Political will to investigate and prosecute atrocities remains variable and often depends on domestic political considerations rather than the severity of the crimes. The prosecution of My Lai only moved forward because of public pressure and media attention. Without Ronald Ridenhour's letter and Seymour Hersh's reporting, the massacre would likely have remained covered up. This suggests that accountability for war crimes cannot be left solely to the military or political establishments, but requires vigilant civil society and media oversight. The concept of moral injury, distinct from, but related to PTSD, has gained recognition partly because of cases like My Lai. Moral injury refers to the psychological harm that comes from committing, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that violate one's moral code. Many of the soldiers at My Lai experienced moral injury, forced to confront the fact that they had done things they knew were wrong. Understanding and treating moral injury has become an important part of veteran mental health care. The question of forgiveness and redemption for those who committed atrocities is difficult and deeply personal. Some believe that anyone who participated in the massacre at My Lai, regardless of circumstances, deserves condemnation and punishment for life. Others believe in the possibility of redemption, that people can change and atone for even terrible acts. William Calley's eventual expression of remorse raises the question of whether that remorse was genuine, and, if so, whether it matters. For the victims and their families, forgiveness is a personal choice that no outsider can prescribe. Some survivors and family members have expressed a desire for justice rather than revenge, seeking acknowledgement and accountability rather than purely punitive measures. Others remain angry and bitter, feeling that nothing can compensate for what was taken from them. Both responses are understandable and valid. The preservation of the My Lai Memorial Site in Vietnam serves multiple purposes. It honors the victims and ensures they are not forgotten. It educates Vietnamese and international visitors about what happened. It stands as a warning against future atrocities, and it provides a physical space where people can confront difficult history and reflect on its meaning. Such memorial sites play an important role in collective memory and historical education. Looking to the future, the challenge is to ensure that the lessons of My Lai are not forgotten, and that effective measures are in place to prevent similar atrocities. This requires ongoing commitment to training soldiers on the laws of war and military ethics. It requires selecting and developing leaders who have the moral courage to do the right thing under pressure. It requires creating cultures within military units that value moral courage and protect those who speak up about wrongdoing. It also requires civilian oversight of the military and willingness by the public to hold political and military leaders accountable for war crimes. Democratic societies must maintain the principle that the military serves the people and is subject to the rule of law. This means supporting robust investigation and prosecution of alleged war crimes, even when politically inconvenient. It means resisting efforts to excuse atrocities as inevitable consequences of war, or to dismiss them as isolated incidents by a few bad actors. The broader political context matters as well. Wars fought without clear objectives, with inadequate planning, with metrics of success that incentivize counterproductive behavior, create conditions where atrocities become more likely. Political leaders who commit military forces should do so with clear goals, adequate resources, proper rules of engagement, and realistic understanding of what military force can and cannot achieve. Avoiding unnecessary wars is the best way to prevent war crimes. International cooperation on prosecuting war crimes needs to be strengthened. The International Criminal Court and other tribunals provide important mechanisms for justice, but they are only as effective as the international community's commitment to support them. Powerful countries must be willing to subject their own nationals to international justice if the system is to have credibility. Selective prosecution based on political considerations undermines the legitimacy of international law. My Lai stands as a stark reminder that the veneer of civilization is thin, that under the wrong circumstances, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil. But it also reminds us that individual moral courage can make a difference, that it is possible to resist pressures to do wrong even in the most difficult situations. The question is whether we will learn these lessons and apply them going forward. More than 50 years after the massacre, My Lai remains relevant. It speaks to fundamental questions about human nature, about the conditions that enable atrocities, about leadership and moral courage, about accountability and justice. As long as wars are fought, as long as people are placed in situations where they have power over others, as long as human nature remains what it is, the lessons of My Lai will be important. We must remember My Lai not to condemn all soldiers or to argue that war always leads to atrocities, but to understand how specific failures of leadership, training, discipline, and judgment can lead to catastrophic moral breakdown. We must remember the victims, the hundreds of men, women, and children whose lives were stolen on that March morning. We must remember the heroes like Hugh Thompson, who had the courage to do the right thing. And we must commit ourselves to ensuring that never again will such an atrocity be committed by those who wear the uniform of the United States or any other nation. The story of My Lai is not comfortable. It does not end with simple resolutions or easy lessons. It challenges us to think deeply about morality in extreme situations, about the nature of evil, about responsibility and accountability. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what humans are capable of, and about the failures and injustices in how we respond to atrocities. But discomfort is not a reason to look away. History must be confronted honestly, especially the darkest parts. Only by understanding what happened at My Lai and why it happened can we hope to prevent it from happening again. The victims deserve to be remembered, the truth deserves to be told, and the lessons deserve to be learned. That is the enduring legacy of My Lai, painful but essential. A reminder of the worst we are capable of, and a challenge to be better.